Okay, chapter 2 of Prairie Lotus. We're going to find out about Papa and Hannah's adventure to the Dakota Territory. As Papa drove the wagon up the wide main street, Hannah rose from her seat at the back and peeked around the edge of the canvas corner. She saw packed dirt streets and buildings of raw lumber identified by hand-lettered signs. A dry goods store, so dry goods store is going to be a store that sells things like flour and grocery things, not vegetables. A dry goods store, a hardware store, a saloon, that would be a bar, a feed store where you buy food for your animals. There was even a furniture shop, which was rare in these lands. It seems like a nice enough place. Wishful thinking. LaForge, that's the name of the town, LaForge was a little different from other frontier towns she had seen. The railroad at the north end, with Main Street at a right angle to it, leading to a livery at the south end. A livery is where you keep your horses, right? It's kind of like it's like a car service almost. A brand new town, equal measure of promise and uncertainty, like the thin April sunshine in which it stood. The hotel was near the depot. Papa got them a room for the night. Hannah climbed the stairs along the outside of the building, carrying a valise, that's a suitcase, along the outside of the building, carrying a valise and a sack atop a wooden box. With her bonnet tied firmly and the load piled high in her arms, her face was mostly hidden from the view. Do you know why she's hiding her face? Think about that. Papa followed her into the room with his own valise. All right, he asked. She set her belongings down and nodded. He went to next to the window and pulled the curtains across. Livery next, he said. I won't be long. He would take their horses, Chester and Cherry, to be boarded at the livery. And park the wagon there too. He didn't have to tell her to stay away from the windows and out of sight. She knew what to do. After so many months of so many towns, Papa always thought it was best that if he acquainted himself with a few folks, set up either a dry goods store or a tailoring, that's sewing business, before people found out about her. And same as always, she couldn't stop herself from hoping maybe this would be the last move for her and Papa, the last time she'd have to hide her face on arriving in a new town. She closed the door behind them and turned the key in the lock. When she crossed the room and put her wooden box on the bed, work would make time go faster. Mama's button box was one of the few things from the shop in Los Angeles that had made the long journey with them. During the trip, the box had been joggled and jostled and overturned completely more than once. She unlatched the little hook, lifted the lid, and saw what she had suspected. Buttons all jumbled together willy-nilly. Rotten eggs, she murmured. That was Mama's favorite curse. Papa had made the box to Mama's design. It was a rectangular tray covered with a hinged lid, fitted with a wooden grid that divided the space inside into dozens of compartments. The largest button box Hannah had ever seen. It held hundreds of buttons that Mama had collected for years. Hannah cherished the button box because it belonged to Mama. Every inch of space in the wagon was needed for traveling essentials, so most of Mama's things had been left behind. And her most prized possession, an enormous mirror fixed to the wall, could not be moved. They had to leave it behind. Hannah had managed to rescue the button box in Mama's favorite wooden shawl. It was brown with a red plaid pattern. Hannah emptied the buttons onto the bag and she began digging through the pile, putting one button into each compartment, rows by size, columns by color. The squares in the lower left corner contained the smallest white buttons. Above it, she put the next size, also white. Each square held a bigger button until she reached the top left, which held the largest white button. And then in the next column, she put the cream-colored buttons, then the beige and the browns and the gray and the black. And after that came the rainbow colors of red, orange, yellow, green, and blue and violet, and several more columns of rows that held novelty buttons, which were shaped like animals or stars or cherries. The buttons were pretty to look at and pleasantly smooth under her fingertips. The order of each button in the proper place was soothing to Hannah. Best of all, sorting the buttons kept her occupied or busy. She put the last few buttons into their compartments and then closed the lid and latched it. She ran her fingers over the carving on the lid. It was a simple 5-petaled lotus. A lotus is a flower. That's in our title, right? Prairie Lotus. So she ran her finger over the carving of the lid, a simple 5-petaled lotus. Mama's favorite flower. It was her trademark. She would use tiny lazy daisy stitches to embroider a lotus into the lining of every garment or clothing that she made. And she taught Hannah to do the same thing. Hannah had never actually seen a lotus plant, but Mama had shown it to her in Chinese paintings and on ceramic vases. So lotus flowers are very popular in Asia and China. Hannah had still seen the first little lotus flower she had ever embroidered, pressed carefully into the Bible that Miss Lorna had given her when they left Los Angeles. It was a square on plain muslin with two lotuses, one done by Mama as an example, and the other by 7-year-old Hannah. Mama's stitches were even, symmetrical, and perfect. Those by Hannah were wobbly and uncertain, but Mama had praised for her effort, and since then Hannah had embroidered a lotus countless times, always striving to make hers as even and as graceful as Mama's. Hannah was putting away the button box when Papa's boots thudded on the stairs. "Is there a school?" Hannah asked. It was always her first question. Some of the towns they had passed through didn't have a school yet, and those that did, they hadn't stayed long enough to enroll. Papa took off his hat, hung it down on a nail near the door. He was tall and lean. His knees and elbows jutted out when he sat in the room's only chair. "Forgot to ask," he said. "I had more important things on my mind. I'll give you the bad news first. There are already 2 dry goods stores, a tailor, and a shirt maker here in town." She knew why it was bad news. No town this size needed 3 dry goods stores or 2 shirt makers. Now, Papa was almost not quite smiling. 2 dry goods stores plus a furniture store? That tells me that there are already plenty of women here. During the endless months of travel from Los Angeles to La Forge, Hannah and Papa had passed through town after town, populated largely by men. The farther west on the frontier, the fewer women lived there. As they traveled east, Hannah and Papa finally reached country where more women were living. Hannah realized what Papa was saying. "There's no dressmaker!" she exclaimed. "I signed a 1-month lease for a building on 2nd Street. I bought it the last vacant lot on the end of Main. We will get a shop built and set up to sell dresses." "And make dresses," she said, her voice edged with defiance. They had argued about this before. It had been fine when she was just a helper at the shop in Los Angeles, but Papa thought that at 14, she was too young for the full responsibility of making dresses for grown women. He went on as if she hadn't spoken. "The drugstore's on one side, the general store on the other. There'll be plenty of traffic on that part of the street." "That sounds fine, Papa," she said. She would keep quiet for now, but she was already scheming to change his mind. "You bought the lot?" she asked, trying to make her words sound like simple curiosity. "Are you questioning my decision?" His voice rose. She knew her Papa could become angered easily. "No, Papa," she said firmly, looking him in the eye. It was true. Papa had his faults, but he was a shrewd businessman. "I'm just wondering why now? Why this place?" Since they sold the shop in Los Angeles, they had always lived and worked in rented buildings. He nodded. The glint of anger faded. "A couple of reasons. First, because of Harris." A man named Philip Harris was the reason Hannah and Papa had come to Dakota. Papa met him years earlier in Kansas, and at the end of last winter, when they decided to leave Cheyenne, Papa had heard that Mr. Harris was the justice of the peace in La Forge. "A good man," Papa had said, "a fair man. Might as well go there as anywhere else. So a justice of the peace is like the judge. He's the person who decides what's right and wrong in the area. Harris will do his best to make sure that we get a fair deal here," he went on. "I'm figuring on giving it until fall. If the shop doesn't do well, we can sell up and move on. There'll be plenty of buyers, town right on the railroad and growing fast." Hannah nodded, more satisfied. Until fall. That's time at least for maybe 1 or 2 terms of school. As a young man barely out of his teens, Papa had left his home in Tennessee to travel west and eventually ended up in Colorado Territory during the gold rush near Pikes Peak. He worked very hard and been lucky, doing very well for himself. When the gold rush was over, he took a job as a supplier for the railroad. He kept moving until he finally reached Los Angeles, California. And he couldn't go any further west. So he set up as a trader in Los Angeles, dealing mostly in dry goods. A year or so later, he met Mama, and they fell in love. It should have been a simple story, but it wasn't, because Mama was Chinese. Orphaned as a toddler, so when she was 2 years old in China, Mama had been taken by American missionaries. Her Chinese name was Mei Li, so the missionaries called her May. They taught her to sew and to read and write as well, and she grew up with their books and stories of their homeland. And when she was 18, she convinced them to let her make the journey to the land that was then known as Gamsan, Golden Mountains. So that's in California, in the United States. One of the missionaries had a sister who ran a boarding house in Los Angeles, California, and that's where May stayed when she first arrived in America with Miss Lorna. She cleaned the house, she helped with the meals, she took in the sewing. Then a young man came to board at Miss Lorna's place. He was setting up a dry goods shop just outside Chinatown in Los Angeles, and he needed a seamstress. May went to work for the young man whose name was Ben. Papa was Ben. The riots in Los Angeles happened when Hannah was 5 years old. By then, they were living above the shop, and she wasn't old enough to understand, but she was plenty old enough to remember. Shouts in the streets, someone pounding the door, more shouting. Take her to Miss Lorna's, Mama said to Papa. You go. You can you can both stay here. You can both stay there, Papa said. No, you, safer with you. Papa held Hannah's hand, pulled her through the streets, filled with people running and shouting and screaming. The air smelled strongly of smoke. Sometimes Papa picked her up and ran along the crowds, and he left her with Miss Lorna. I'll be back for her as soon as I can, he said over Hannah's head. I'll keep her as long as you need, Miss Lorna said. You're not to worry about her. Hannah stayed at Miss Lorna's for what he felt like forever, but it was really only a few days before Papa returned. The news was bad. At least 15 Chinese men had been lynched. Lynched means they were hung and killed. Chinese owned houses and businesses had been ransacked, looted, and burned. So people were stealing things and burning things down from Chinese people. While Papa stood guard at his shop, Mama had gone to check on her friends. In trying to help them save their noodle shop, she had been overcome with smoke and collapsed. Papa brought her home. He and Hannah nursed her as best they could, but her lungs were badly damaged. The sounds of her coughing and wheezing and gasping filled the house hour by hour, day and night. Each cough made Hannah flinch, imagining the pain her mother was feeling, the constant, desperate strain for something simple like air. Mama struggled on for 6 years like that. On a cold, rainy morning in February, a few months before Hannah's 12th birthday, a thick silence woke her. She got out of the bed. She saw that the door to her parents' room was ajar. She peeked around the edge of the door. Mama was lying on a quilt on the floor. She was curled up on her side, and Hannah could see her face so calm and sweet that she was almost smiling. Sitting on the edge of the bed in his nightshirt, Papa cleared his throat and looked up at Hannah and looked up and saw Hannah. She must have gotten out of the bed in the middle of the night, he said. She didn't want to wake me. I never felt or heard a thing. Hannah tiptoed into the room, sat down at the foot of the bed. Where your mama came from. A lot of people sleep on the floor, he said. Only rich people have beds. Hannah's eyes were watering as she wiped away the tears with the sleeve of her nightgown. Is that what she was doing, Mama? Sleeping the way she used to? Partly, maybe, but I think somehow that she knew the end was coming, and she knew that no one likes to sleep in a bed where someone has died. He shook his head. Always had to be thinking of someone else, and look where it got her. Hannah hoped that anger in his voice was just his way of being sad. She concentrated on looking at Mama's face, so peaceful, her last present to me, to know she was at peace when the end came and she died. The wave of grief that swept over Hannah receded a little when she realized that the terrible wheezing sounds had stopped. 3 weeks later, Papa sold the shop and he bought a wagon. They packed up and left to search for a place to live that would be free of Mama's ghosts, the memory of her sickness, of her death, and the riot that eventually killed her. So that's the end of chapter 2.